So I just start straight away. Well, my name's Chris, and this paper is basically just some work I've been doing towards my doctoral thesis, which is about sectarianism and also anti-sectarianism in Iraq in the 1920s and 1930s among the Shia community. Basically, the paper sort of looks at two Shia discourses which emerged following the institution of the Iraqi state. What I think is significant for this is the expansion of print media in Iraq and the wider Middle East during this period, and the kind of the new phase in Sunni-Shia relations that was the 1920s and 1930s were characterized by. So the first of these discourses, and when I say discourses, I basically just mean a way of writing and thinking about sectarianism, was political and unique to Iraq. It saw Shia writers expressing their grievances with the current political, economic and social status quo and promoting a populist vision for a more equitable national future. And the second, which developed in response to the sort of deterioration in intersect relations, was less nationally specific and saw sort of Arab Iraqi intellectuals and ulema promoting and carrying out an overtly anti-sectarian campaign that focused on a unified vision of Islam, and also, importantly, was quite a lot about rehabilitating the public image of Shiism for those outside of the faith. By the way, I've got a PowerPoint there at the back, but you can only see it there. It's not here. So basically, the paper is going to highlight some of the key themes running through both of these distinct but overlapping discourses, and I argue that both of them borrow heavily from each other. So they shouldn't be considered as just sort of two distinct entities competing with each other, but sort of very much intertwined, and sometimes one person or individual or organization can kind of jump between the two very, very quickly and in the same period. So the contradictions between the two were played out in the pages of one of the leading Shia journals of the 20th century, which is Al-Irfan, which was actually published in Lebanon, but obviously a lot of Iraqis wrote there and wrote in it. And I believe that if we analyse this text and this material, we can really highlight some of the sort of intellectual and cultural struggles of the Shia community as it grappled with the sort of challenges of modernity and integration into the national state. So just a brief sort of historiographical background. Work on sectarianism in Iraq, especially historical work, has tended to question whether Sunni-Shia relations and the conflict between them was an important factor in the politics and national development during the monarchical period. So this is before 1958, with some historians arguing that it was and others arguing that it wasn't, or more or less that sort of sectarian cleavages had been negated by processes of national integration by the end of the monarchical period, so the education and the army and things like that. The historiographical differences between much of the work to date seems to be built on the extent to which historians believe that the state successfully integrated these primordial identities. So much of the work, as far as I'm concerned, seems to hold historical development as linear, from primordial association to class consciousness, religious to national, and ultimately sectarian to ideological. And little work, with some notable exceptions, has sort of entertains the notion that sectarian political identities were actually renewed, reinvented, and crucially actually resisted following the establishment of the state and the onset of modernity, in competition with other political trends at the time. So I'm hoping that this analysis of Shia cultural production will rectify some of the shortfalls and kind of move away from the more top-down political histories we've seen, and also the more, I suppose, what you could describe as primordial sect histories, which just look at a particular sect and don't really question whether these modern political identities are created anew in the modern era. So looking at the first discourse that I want to discuss, which is which I've described as the campaign for Shia rights and representation. A brief background on sort of Shia political activism in the 1920s. Obviously, after the constitution of the Iraqi state, the Shia majority more or less found themselves underrepresented in the state bureaucracy, the council of ministers and the parliament, and obviously the judiciary. State investment favoured Sunni areas, and there was a kind of endemic corruption which compounded these inequalities. And at the same time, in the Sunni world more generally, but especially in Iraq, the period saw an increase in anti-Shia polemic, and well, just basically, just not very nice stuff about Shias in the public sphere, in the press. So the first political expression of Shia grievances emerged in 1927 with the Nahda party, and that sought to leverage power for the Shias by using constitutional means. So it basically formed a modern political party, and by encouraging British intercession on their behalf, because at this point Britain was obviously still the colonial power in Iraq. However, this party died out pretty quickly, and by about 1930 it no longer existed. And then there was a second resurgence of Shia political activity between sort of 1929 and 1935. This lacked the same institutional structure as the previous iteration, and was characterized by sort of a literary campaign in Al-Irfan and the publication of petitions across Iraq. And it did ultimately culminate in some tribal disturbances in 1935, but I'm not going to look at that too much. Basically, I just want to look at the way that writers, Iraqi writers, talked about or expressed their sectarian sentiment in Al-Irfan specifically, in the sort of the early 1930s. So anyway, by showing that the Shias constituted the majority of the Iraqi population, the campaigners, in their articles and in their petitions, developed a populist discourse which distinguished between repressed Shia masses and a corrupt political elite. They sought to undermine the sectarian pretensions of their claims by discursively aligning the Shia majority with the Iraqi Ummah in general, and by adopting sort of anonymous pseudonyms, such as an Arab or an Iraqi Arab. The writers tried to speak for the whole Arab nation, and they presented Shias and Iraqis as essentially one and the same thing, controlled by, and this is to quote, a clique that has no links to the country or its history, all of whom were outsiders chosen by the occupiers to enhance their influence. So the foreignness of the elite, according to these writers, was also evident in the fact that they had heard to virtues, customs and sentiments which were contradicted the traditional Arab sentiments of the majority. And then, so by affirming the Arabness of the Iraqi Shias, and especially the Fellahin, and this is the peasantry, the writers argued that they were the sort of the closest to the land of Iraq, and therefore its sort of most authentic population, unlike the Sunni minority and foreign minority, as they claimed, that was supposedly ruling the country. And this sort of dovetailed very nicely with a focus on the economic hardships that the Fellahin were experiencing. So the Shia campaigners contended that class and sectarian affiliation overlapped completely in Iraq, and they saw the nation split into two classes, with the free landowners on the one side, and then, and this is to quote again, slaves on the other, that is, us Shias, living in poverty, displacement, injustice, and vagabondage. So the campaigners considered themselves to be spokesmen for this oppressed majority, or what might be called a kind of, almost like a Shia middle-class vanguard, or I suppose sectarian entrepreneurs promoting their rights on the national stage. And I think these sentiments come across quite nicely in a poem from 1933 that was published in Al-Irfan after a Shia minister was sacked from the Iraqi government for trying to promote an irrigation project that would have benefited the Fellahin. So he says, this writer, who I think anonymously pseudonymed an Iraqi Arab or something like that, a minority is ruling a majority, unlawfully seizing its land. If you examine the elite, you will not find anyone living luxuriously except on our account. Oh, and then the minister's name, who was Rustam Haidar, they banished you, and with that they sought to exclude us. We want unity and they deny it, and this is the only differentiation between us. So they sort of, obviously there's this heavy focus on this populist message coming through, but then at the end it's also quite important that the final line of this poem really focuses on the fact that supposedly they aren't sectarian and supposedly they're trying to promote this vision of Iraqi unity. So the next kind of historical motif of the sectarian discourse that they were promoting was looked at Iraqi history, recent Iraqi history, and specifically the injustices suffered by the Shia community during the Iraqi Revolution of 1920. So the campaigners framed this revolution as an incident of exclusive Shia sacrifice, which had delivered the state from direct colonial subjugation. So they would talk about how the Iraqi state was essentially built on the skulls of the Shia, and yet now they found themselves excluded and basically barred from any sort of genuine participation in the government or any and from its resources. So anyway, by making recourse to recent Iraqi history and the Shia closeness to the land, the campaigners built a discourse of exclusion and injustice, intended, I would argue, to inculcate a sense of shared Shia grievances and political consciousness among the population of Iraq. And by aligning Shia-ness with Arabness and Iraqi-ness, they did not contradict the Arab or Iraqi nationalist ideological foundations of the state. So according to the writers, the populist struggle of the Shia against the state was not really sectarian at all, but a rights issue between an indigenous majority and a corrupt foreign elite. I think it's quite interesting at this point to consider who the main architects or the main campaigners for this sectarian struggle were. And anyway, if we look at the people writing in Al-Irfan, alongside those who chose not to include their name, we actually see, mostly people that I've not been able to find any information about, and maybe that's because I haven't looked hard enough. Apart from one guy who wrote several articles called Ibn Rafidin, and he claimed that he was a member of the educated Shia youth unable to secure a position in the state bureaucracy or the government, and his articles were a direct expression of this sentiment of exclusion. And then if we sort of look at British intelligence reportage as well on the Shia movements that were appearing at the time, we can see there's quite a lot that supports the notion that its main proponents were young men without prominent positions in the political or economic life of Iraq. So while investigating a petition that was published in 1932, the British concluded that the main move were mainly teachers and students whose personal influence was minimal. So I think from this, again, we can see that the movement was finding some of its strongest support from a kind of burgeoning new Effendi class of young educated Shias in Iraq, whose economic and political aspirations were not being fulfilled within the state apparatus, and who were therefore sort of using their sectarian identity as a mechanism to improve their prospects. And this isn't obviously to say that the sectarian pretensions of these men didn't have any supporters among kind of more prominent members of the Shia elite in Iraq. It's like the ulema and the notables, but it's certainly the main movers and the main activists seem to be from a kind of a new middle class group. So anyway, despite the efforts that were sustained throughout the 1920s and 1930s, the campaigners don't seem to have achieved any significant political traction. And a similar device had obviously overcome the pretty much all previous Shia political campaigns in Iraq throughout the 1920s. The Nahda movement, for example, just died out within a year. And I think one of the main reasons for this, and the campaigners were very aware of this themselves, is that the sort of political terrain in Iraq was one in which any expression of sectarian sentiment at this time were considered highly damaging and essentially a social taboo. So it really wasn't kind of okay to be talking about these things at the time. And you can actually see the aversion to accusations of sectarianism laced into the writings of the Shia campaigners themselves. So despite the prejudicial tone of a lot of the work, which actually sort of seeks to delegitimize the ruling elite on the basis of their foreignness or Arabness, even when a lot of the ruling elite were actually obviously from Iraq, all the articles are predicated on a call for unity and equality. And as the last line to the poem reads, we want unity and they deny it. This is the only differentiation between us. And allusions to sort of general Sunni prejudices are quite rare. It's very much the nation against the elite, not necessarily the Sunnis against the Shias. And it's interesting because Al-Irfan, the newspaper where all of this stuff is published, had very kind of progressive and reformist credentials and had been committed to notions of Islamic unity since its inception in, I think, 1909. And it would often footnote articles that had sectarian pretensions, apologizing for statements which distinguish between Sunnis and Shias, or sometimes even follow any article which was sectarian with a non-sectarian article, which is actually quite jarring. If you see one person talking about all this inequality and then immediately followed by another Iraqi who's saying actually, an Iraqi Shia as well, saying no, there's no inequality in Iraq, everyone has the same political and civil rights. And I think it's really here that we can see the ambiguity of this ostensibly sectarian discourse and the inner turmoil of many of its main architects as they sought sort of not to diverge completely from this more acceptable response to national integration which was circulating at the time. And this is the next thing that we'll now move to, which is this sort of popular discourse of Islamic unity and sectarian resistance and anti-sectarianism. So I've talked here, moving on to this second discourse, we talk about Islamic unity and also Shia public relations, because a big aspect of it was about rehabilitating the external image of the community, I believe, to the Sunni, to a kind of very Sunni, critical Sunni discourse which was emerging at the time. So I think that the media revolution of the second Ottoman constitutional period, which was vastly accelerated during the mandatory period. If you look at the number of newspapers that emerged and obviously the publishing houses that opened after sort of 1918, it's really phenomenal. In Iraq, this is provided a really fertile ground for the spread of ideas around Islamic unity. But at the same time, they also provided a platform for the popularization of very negative stereotypes and false knowledge about Shiism, which had hitherto, I think, more or less been confined to the religious academic sphere. So the destructive impact of this media, of the new media revolution for Shia integration and Islamic unity, I believe, became especially evident in the 1920s when there was a sort of sustained flurry of anti-Shia material began to appear across the region, and especially in Iraq, and it actually caused, on some occasions, quite a lot of civil unrest. So the advocates of Islamic and Arab unity within the Shia clerical and intellectual establishment, I think, were aware that this derogation didn't just spring from Sunni sectarian chauvinism, and they realized that as much of a problem was this ignorance of Shiism, and that therefore the most appropriate response was essentially to provide correct and accessible information rather than to necessarily kind of hit back with polemical material. So I think we can see the Shia campaign to correct the misrepresentation of the sect and promote this non-sectarian vision of unity found one of its most lucrative platforms, ironically, in Al-Irfan, as well as other journals in the Sunni world, such as the Egyptian Al-Risala. And then, of course, campaigners published books and pamphlets on Shia beliefs, practices, and history. And this slide just shows a selection of some of the most, well, I think some of the most significant. The single most significant, in my opinion, is probably by the Iraqi Marja, Mohammed Hussein Kashif al-Ghitta, who wrote The Origins and Principles of Shiism. And then we have other works, sort of the defense of Shiism, just basically histories of Shiism, which I think was quite novel at in this time. I think it was the first time people were writing kind of popular, or more or less popular books on just general Shia history or general Shia beliefs for a non-specialist audience. And they all seem to appear in almost exactly the same time, which is just the beginning of the 1930s. And then we also see books or pamphlets on particular aspects of Shia belief and doctrine, trying to justify them or prove their kind of compatibility with modernity. For example, on temporary marriage or and aspects and things such as that. This campaign transcended the divide between clerical and non-clerical figures in the Shia community. So you see both groups participating with lay writers, such as historians or I suppose you could almost call them journalists, reaching out to less educated, non-specialist and, well, most significantly, non-Shia mass audiences, while the ulema would endorse them by writing introductions to their work. And I think if we look at the activities of Al-Ghita, who is the guy on the left here, especially, they are kind of exemplary of the strategies adopted by these campaigners to rehabilitate the reputation of Shiism and integrate with the Sunni mainstream during this period. As well as publishing books and articles, he was the first Shia Marja to deliver a speech at a Pan-Islamic Congress in Jerusalem in 1931, where he obviously talked about the importance of unity and overcoming divisions in the Ummah. And he also received cultural delegations in Najaf, where he showcased the Shia educational establishment and challenged Sunni writers on their views. Famously, Ahmed Amin came and saw him and he had an argument with him. And then in 1933, he published his most influential work, one of his most influential works, which is The Origins and Principles of Shiism. And it was a direct response to negative interpretations about the sect, which Sunni writers had been espousing due to their lack of knowledge about the religion, according to him. So to counter their claims, he basically delves into Islamic history to show how the early followers of Ali were, prominent companions of the Prophet. But I think crucially, although he presents evidence to show the truth and the correctness of Shia tradition by, for example, showing that Muhammad did appoint Ali to be his successor, he never ever strays into anything that would be considered polemical. And for example, he notes that the first three caliphs may not have, or certainly did not consciously violate the words of the Holy Prophet in superseding Ali, and they just might not have heard him when he obviously appointed him as his successor. So it's not so much apologetic, I think, but it's just trying to sort of promote this really non-controversial interpretation of Islamic history, and really highlighting the points of similarity and cohesion between the two groups. So for Al-Ghita and his peers, I don't believe that Islamic unity meant the abrogation of religious differences between Sunnis and Shias. Rather, they argued, and they always use this expression, that a Sunni should view a Shia as a Hanafi views a Shafi, or a Maliki a Hanbali. And in doing this, their work celebrated the spirit of sort of diversity and independence of thought running through the Quran and Sunnah. So both of these traits, Al-Ghita often noted, were bestowed on the Islamic people by God. And this is evident in the fact that there were many differences of opinions among the companions on matters like washing, ritual ablution, and obviously quite significantly marriage. So there was this sort of almost this kind of pluralism that they really kind of celebrate in their writing that's quite interesting. Now, as well as this, a key aspect of the campaign was, like I said, to rehabilitate the reputation of the Shia on the international stage, essentially. And then quite a common and popular strategy for doing this was to assess controversial aspects of the faith, or aspects of the faith that often came under intense scrutiny against modern, or what they considered to be modern, institutions and ideas. So on one such issue, which is taqiyya, like emulation or hiding of one's religion, which the Shias practiced a lot during the pre-modern period, Abdul Razak al-Hassani, who is a famous Iraqi historian, he directly compares the Shia with a German minority living outside of Germany, hiding their opposition to the local authority. And this is obviously in 1933, when there was a significant minority outside of Germany. And he says that in these circumstances, it would be inappropriate to stigmatize the German minority, or sort of say that they were undertaking an immoral action, because it was taken with the noble and rational objective of preserving their existence as a people. And he also talks about mutta, the temporary marriage, and rather bizarrely compares it to something that had been instituted in the developed world, in America, where he seemed to think that the government had legalized temporary marriage. I don't think that the American government has ever done that, but the fact that he said it, obviously he read something about it. And anyway, the point is that there's this real tendency to sort of prove how these supposedly backward traditions, which were coming under like increased public scrutiny at the time, were actually compatible and rational and compatible with modernity. And we can see a similar tendency in the Ashura debates, which occurred throughout the 1920s. And I think Max Weiss's work on this shows how both those that supported the continuation of self-flagellations during the mourning ceremonies for Hussein, and those who opposed them, were very keen to demonstrate that their side of the arguments were the most rational and the most sort of non-backward. So then, as well as this, the campaigners were also looked into Shia history as well, and they wanted to prove that the Arabness of the Shia, to counter the very common stigmatization that Shiism was an Iranian or Jewish conspiracy. So this tendency appears in their historical writings throughout the period, and they also struggle here. They're talking much like the rights campaigners who we talked about before. They highlight the Shi'aness of Iraq, and how Iraq has this long and rich history of Shiism, stretching back right to the period of the Islamic conquest. Proof of the Shia commitment to unity and Iraqi patriotism could also be found in accounts of the Iraqi Revolution of 1920. But crucially, in contrast to the rights campaigners who we discussed previously, who had framed the revolution as a period of distinct Shia suffering, the campaigners, or one of them, such as Muhammad Rida al-Muzaffar, framed the insurrections as a period of Sunni-Shia collaboration against the repression of the colonial overlords, and actually proof of the expediency and possibility of unity in the modern period. According to the reformers, the greatest contradiction in the situation of discord was that it was occurring in the modern age, which was ostensibly one of knowledge, progress, and understanding. So it was the responsibility of the ulema and the intellectual class, they constantly say, to challenge ignorance where it existed and promote a correct non-sectarian knowledge. So this non-sectarian knowledge is seen as the sort of antithesis of ignorance, which is sectarian knowledge. So Muhammad Rida al-Muzaffar, the same one, I think he realized that the triumph of such a movement required, quite diligent effort. So the work of publishing houses, educational institutions, and of course the press. So in Najaf, he established the Muntad al-Nashr in 1935 as a reformist publishing house and school. And at least in part, this institution was established with an anti-sectarian intention. So I think what's crucial here is that the popularization of a new, correct anti-sectarian knowledge seemed to be a project which needed dissemination and comprehension from, if not kind of like the illiterate masses, then at least the literate middle stratum of society. And so really, like any kind of public information campaign, it required non-elite participation and understanding. And I think a final note on this concerns audience. So despite the intention of the Shia intellectual establishment to speak to those outside of the faith and manage Shiism's external image, the internal implications of their work shouldn't be overlooked. Because in part, this movement was as much to assure Shias that the slanderous views they came across in the Sunni press were incorrect, and provide them with the knowledge and sort of acumen to rebuff these false claims. And in part, the quest for Islamic unity was as much the responsibility of the Shia community as it was the Sunnis. And I think it was obviously also important to sort of correct people's Shia's understandings of the tenets of their faith simply for its own sake, and obviously make them aware of the compatibility of their religion with the Sunni mainstream. So I think in this respect, there's kind of an irony in the work in this campaign, if not a contradiction running through the movement. Because while it sought to undermine the differences between Muslims and promote this vision of Islamic unity, it also essentially affirmed and standardized Shia beliefs and understandings, and actually sort of clearly differentiated Imami Shia tradition from any competing factions, whether that be Sunni or heterodox Shia groups. And it really sought to popularize this new coherence to the religion. And this is particularly clear in the scathing rhetoric which some of the campaigners use against, obviously, all non-Imami groups. And they're often quite, very highly, they basically say that they're not Shia, although they say they're not Shias, they completely remove them from the sect. So their message of unity and integration, as much as it is a message of unity and integration, actually promoted and popularized to a Sunni and a Shia lay readership a highly restricted definition of Shiism that excluded pretty much all of the sect's non-Imami adherents. So anyway, just a final conclusion. The two discourses that I've talked about, the political campaign for Shia rights and the kind of cultural campaign for unity, were competing responses to marginalization and discrimination in the nascent Iraqi state, rendered possible by the emergence and expansion of print media in the early 20th century. I think in their rhetorical commitment to unity and equality, both the discourses overlapped, but in other important respects, as I've discussed, they diverged considerably. And while the unity advocates spoke to those outside of the faith, the rights campaigners seemed to be addressing the Iraqi Shi'is themselves in an attempt to inculcate this sense of shared modern Shia political identity and consciousness. And I think frequently the inner turmoil of the Shia writers navigating the contradictions between these two discourses is evident within a single article or publication, which kind of demonstrates the complexity of this sectarianism as it's developing at the time. Taken collectively, I would argue that the two discourses signified a reconceptualization of what Shiism meant for those inside and outside of the faith. As a set of beliefs and practices, I think it was becoming more defined, more rigid, and crucially more understandable than before, as well as more rational and modern, well, to an extent. And as a modern political movement, I think it was essentially invented in Iraq, in an Iraqi context, for the first time, to launch what can only really be described as a populist political demands. Right, and that's it.
I believe I'm the first person who is going to comment on the paper. Before I come to that, I would just like to thank Dana and the Doha Institute for the invitation Arab Center, sorry, Arab Center. Okay, the ACRPS. Yeah, sorry for the invitation. It's a great pleasure being here in Qatar. I'm very pleased, and I'm looking very much forward to the coming days to learn a lot about sectarianism. I believe anti-sectarianism as well, and so on and so forth from all your presentations. So I'm very pleased being here, and I was also very pleased reading this paper. I enjoyed it very much, also your presentation. The paper is well written, it's a really interesting topic. You have an interesting argument, claim to fame, and it also contributes to a number of important debates. So it was really a pleasure. Usually when I have four questions often in my mind, also when I comment on thesis projects and so on and so forth. I ask, I reflect upon what, why, how, who cares? What is the topic actually? Do I learn something about what is the topic? Why? Why is it important? Why should I read it? Why should the person writing use his or her time engaging in that topic? How is that project being approached, addressed? And the who cares question is actually not meant in a negative way, but what kind of a debate do you want to contribute, engage with? So what is who are the audience? So these four questions I had in mind when I prepared my comments. As for the what and why, I think you make a very good framing of your paper. You make the classic trick, which is often the good thing to do, to point to a gap. There's a problem in the existing literature, and therefore there's a need of your paper. And you present that in a convincing way. And there you also engage with some of the you problematize some of the existing literature as for a kind of, what you argue is that most of the literature takes the point of departure in a kind of primordial understanding, and then the question is whether it has been in the modern period attempts to address to counter these primordial sentiments have been successful or not, and then you come with a counter argument that sectarianism should not be seen as primordial but as a modern phenomena, and so I enjoyed that very much. My main comments relates to the why and the who cares. As for the why, I would be interesting if you could elaborate a bit more as for the time period you are focusing on, and not because it is not an interesting, important, or that it is wrong, anything, but maybe it could be interesting to elaborate a bit more in a revised version of the paper. Why do you choose to focus exactly on this time period? Then, as for theory, one may also, and it depends also. I'm a political scientist of background, so we have a kind of fetish when it comes to theory. So the theory section is a bit or your use of theory. You use theory, but it is quite implicit. You point at the role of print media, the modern state, and so on and so forth. But it could be interesting to be a bit more explicit on that, because you have ideas and you have your own thoughts, you engage in theoretical debates, but it is in an implicit way, so to speak. A third dimension as for the how is also the conceptual question. I think that is the standard question I will be able to ask in every time I'm asked to comment on a paper. What does sectarianism actually mean for you? Because there's so much confusion. It's an example of this essentially contested concept where all of us believe we know it, and then if we put three people together discussing sectarianism, we end up with 6 definitions. So some of the confusion sometimes is that people are using the same term sectarianism for very different kind of phenomena. So when you talk about sectarianism, what is meant actually for you, and more, how do you observe sectarianism? Because that's also an issue that because you have a discourse theoretical approach, looking at journals, rhetoric, and so on and so forth, and it is perfectly valid and fine, and you are able to see something through that kind of discourse or this kind of approach, and there are other things you will not see. So maybe it could also be interesting with some reflections on the approach you have chosen. What does that enable you, and what for instance, if we look at the official rhetoric in Syria before 2011, sectarianism didn't exist and didn't play a role at all. So if we only read these official statements, we would get one kind of picture of what Syria was like. But if we had other kinds of approaches, we may have ended up with a very, very different kind of conclusion. So I'm just wondering maybe it could be fine to be blunt about what does we learn through looking at rhetoric, and also what do we learn by looking at a single journal. What is the kind of journal? Who read this journal? How many did actually read this journal? And it is just to specify the scope. What kind of group of people did read it, and what kind of audience were influenced by the writings in this journal could be interesting to learn about. And maybe also to be blunt about, so your data is this journal, and it's perfectly fine, but maybe also make an argument, a strong argument, why is it an interesting way of examining your topic. Then the who cares, and I think a lot of people should care about this paper. I think it's important in many ways, and it speaks to different kind of audiences. In a revised version, maybe you should also reflect yourself upon what is the main audience for you, because it actually contributes to different kinds of debates, and you can emphasize different parts of the paper depending on what kind of audience you actually want to engage with. One kind of audience, obviously, is Iraq specialist, and those who think that Iraq is the most important thing in the world. And it is a complete valid point. Other some agree, some disagree, but one kind of audience is the Iraqi specialist. Another kind of audience is the audience dealing more in general terms as for this primordialism, instrumentalism debate. I'm going to talk more about that tomorrow morning. But there also Iraq is a case study. As for the question about the inventedness and the modernness of sectarianism and so on and so forth. So that's another kind of audience. A third kind of audience would be Simon Mabon and his project SEPART, sectarization, desectarization, and proxy wars. But a dimension of that research project relates to desectarization, anti-sectarianization, post-sectarian movements, and all that. And you are speaking very much into that debate, and that's really an emerging research interest, how to counter sectarianism and how to think beyond, say, sectarianism. Much of that debate also right now with the events in Lebanon, with events in Iraq, is focused at current events. But your paper could be an important contribution to that debate by pointing to, actually, we have had those kind of movements also in earlier periods. If we go back to the 30s and to the 20s, 30s, we see similar kind of movements, and some of the strategies actually which we find today are to some extent quite similar. Elvira Kobos, who used to be at Aarhus University, where I come from, she's in Edinburgh right now, has made a paper on Shia unity discourses in the UK, where she compares, she develops 3 or 4 different kinds of unity discourses among the Shia in the UK. One of them emphasizes how Shia and Sunni actually they are quite alike because both of them are Muslims. So actually the differences is not the important thing because they share so much. That's one discourse. Another kind of discourse she identifies is one that emphasizes the contribution to Islam as such among the early Shia scholars, how they played an important role in Islam as such. A third kind of version she identifies is one that said there are differences, but it is not between Shia and Sunni, but between the mainstream and the radicals. And there, then, the rhetoric then is to make a construction of the Salafi Wahhabi as the minority radicals, and then you have the mainstream, which is most of the Shia and most of the Sunnis. So suddenly the Shia will not be a minority, but a majority. So actually she identifies these discourses in the UK context today among Shias. And it could be interesting to make a comparison to see to what extent are these, is this discourse of today in the UK similar to a discourse you find among Shias in Iraq in the 1920s, 30s. So actually it could be interesting to say that this paper could also be in a dialogue with a broader desectarization debate. And the fourth and last point of debate you are engaging with, more or less explicitly, implicitly, is also this point about how the paradoxes. For instance, that you have this kind of this movement which officially it attempt to get rid of all kind of misunderstandings as for Shia and emphasizing Islamic unity and so on and so forth, but maybe unintentionally you end up making a kind of more rigid understanding of what is Shia and excluding other kinds of understanding than the 12er understanding of Shia. So there are these paradoxes, like sometimes in a project I have been involved in, we have talked about anti-sectarian sectarianism, as those, for instance, when for instance some Shias are saying we Shia, we are not sectarian. Then on the one hand you try to distance yourself from sectarianism by emphasizing we Shia, we are not, then you inscribe the distinction between Shia and Sunni. So there you have a paradox, and you also point to some paradoxes in your paper. So I think there's a lot of potential in this paper, and maybe it is just to decide on how to frame it, which of the potential audiences you want to direct your attention to mainly. Mm-hmm. So thank you for a good read.
Oh, thank you. Should I? Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, I think it's probably a problem with history a lot of the time, the who cares question, because I think we just like writing kind of nice stories, and sometimes they don't really have any significance. I suppose, yeah, why the 1920s and 1930s, which is what the period is interesting. I just think that obviously there's just perhaps the periodization is slightly wrong, and you should maybe start from a slightly earlier bit. Go back to maybe the Ottoman constitutional revolution, because it really seems like just the first few decades of the 20th century is really when you get this massive change, this massive kind of cultural political change in Iraq that's really accelerated, and maybe that's when the impact of when you really see this sort of sectarian move as well. And I suppose, the question of what does sectarianism mean to me is a very big one, which I'll probably have to think about for a long time. I suppose it goes a tiny bit back to what we were talking about this morning with the imagined communities, and this idea of a taif to taifiyya via, in the modern period, creating sectarian imagined communities. Obviously, Anderson's kind of main point is that you have to have print capitalism for this to be possible, and I guess that's why I wanted to focus so much on the sort of the media revolution in the Middle East at this period, because you can really see how these writers are creating an imagined community out of the Shia in Iraq. But it's not so much necessarily a Shia imagined community. It's actually an Iraqi Shia imagined community at this point. Yeah, it's very much a marginalized Iraqi identity that just happens to be Shia as well. Yeah, and it's very interesting about obviously the contemporary stuff in the UK. That'd be really interesting to look at that, because I think this is in this period you get a pioneering of some of these ideas about unity among Shia scholars, which I think have been carried through. Yeah, thank you very much. No, it's very useful.
Okay, can you hear me? May I take the opportunity to thank the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies. As somebody who's a non-expert, but an historian of Western Europe, this is a fascinating, challenging, and very stimulating experience for me. So I'm very much looking forward to engaging with you over the coming days. More often than not, my heart sinks slightly when I'm confronted with a chapter from a PhD or a proto-PhD. I think it's fair to say that PhDs are not the sort of reading that are noted for enjoyment or pleasure. On this occasion, actually, things looked up considerably. I'm certainly not an expert on Iraqi history, but I found this a most engaging piece of work. I thought it was well written. And well written sounds like a bit of a cliche, but well written for me is something that is clear, it has a purpose, it tells you just enough to be able to follow an argument cogently and intelligently. It doesn't bombard the reader with excessive information. So it was with great relief that I read through this, and I learned something, which I think is a very good sign. I learned a lot about about similarities in things like print media, cultural politics, the politics of identities, and how people invent identities. So on that very generic level, I thought this piece of writing was actually a model for how you might structure a proto-chapter. I know it's quite a small piece, it's nine pages. And I should say at this point, we have a habit of expecting small pieces of work to do everything. It's unreasonable. I mean, there's only so much you can say. There's only so much you can address in a short piece of writing. So some of my comments should be taken in that light. They're about how you might improve and how you might expand. I very much, Chris, liked the way you structured your piece around two discourses. So immediately it gave us a sense of where we were going. And I'm somebody who tells students always, tell us where we're going as the reader. Bring the reader with you, okay? It's a process of seduction, if you wish, intellectual seduction. Don't make this difficult for your reader, right? And I thought, Chris, you told us where you were going, and we were able to follow you. You structured it around the two thematic, the discourses, Shia rights and representation, Shia public relations, and Islamic unity. I wondered if the term public relations, for me, sounded slightly odd, that it was something that you might have associated with Madison Avenue in the 1970s and 80s, okay? So perhaps Shia self-fashioning might be I would think about it, just public relations sounded too utilitarian, too functionalist for me, for something that's much more interesting, actually, than pure public relations. I also thought, and I think, Martin, you touched on this, there's a bit of a conceptual tension at the heart of this movement, this newspaper. And on the one hand, they're creating an identity which at times seems a little bit rigid and formulaic, but on the other hand, it's also very innovative. So there's this curious balancing act going on here between innovation and conservatism, and that I think can be found in all parts of the world. You know, so often one finds historically that these kind of cultural movements have a conservative core, and then there's an element of innovation. I'd like to have known much more about Al-Irfan, because I think it would help us contextualize it more accurately. I assume it's part of an ecology of interesting publications by maybe angry young men who've been denied position in a neo-colonialist context. It struck me, I mean, the British intelligence reports with their no doubt usual acuity identify these men as people who were on the margins, but they're not in ways that they're well educated, but they're being denied formal progress. I think you said at one point it was actually printed in Beirut, is that correct? Yeah. So they're actually, where are they based? Are they in Iraq? In Iraq, okay. So again, it's got a kind of transnational dimension, which I thought could have been emphasized more. These men, I think, who are writing, I think you need to find out, if it's possible, you need to find out more about them. I think looking at a journal in a kind of a vacuum is interesting, but actually much more interesting if you can locate that journal in a broader cultural context. So who are these guys? Could we find out more, if possible? So there's a biographical task there. Okay, if the British dismissed them as people who were dissatisfied, as people who were on the margins, it seems to me in their own social context they are something of an elite. They're well educated, they know how to harness the technology of print, and it is a technology. So at one level they're at the cutting edge. I wanted to know more about literacy standards. Who would be reading this? Is it confined to a very small middle class? Does it have a broader readership? Would it have been read aloud? I mean, is it possible that there would have been an oral dimension to this, that people would have listened to this? So I wanted to know more about the audience, and these are the sort of desired things that it's not possible to do in 9 pages, so take these comments in the spirit that they're meant in. But it's also, for me, as somebody who's very much interested in colonialism and sectarianism, it's I think you called it a cultural production, yeah, but in a very specific neo-colonial context. It tells us a lot about the power of print, and again, print seems to have come late to some regions. Why? But that's not to say that, you know, print has been identified as a kind of an ancillary of modernity. I'm not entirely in agreement with that. It seems to me there are other ways, pre-print, oral circulation, scribal circulation, which are just as important in certain societies and that to equate print with modernity is not necessarily axiomatic. There are other ways of communicating ideas just as effectively. And for me at the moment, as we live through another revolution in communications, rather like Gutenberg's invention of the fixed type in the mid-15th century, we're living through a revolution in communications ourselves that we don't quite comprehend, and we aren't clear as to where it's going to go. You write in an accessible fashion. I think Martin said that you could tie what you're doing into broader debates. It seems to me to be pertinent to broader debates in the area of ethnicity, religious identities. And I've been very struck this morning by how our speakers have stressed that sectarianism isn't necessarily about religious conflict. And I'm going to talk about the situation in Northern Ireland, I think, later. And it very much isn't about religious dogma. Sectarianism seems to me is about questions of power, access, who dominates a society, and it's certainly not about arcane issues dating back to the 16th century on substantiation, consubstantiation, and so on. So I think we need to be careful that it's not religious conflict as we might understand it, or theological disagreement. It's about broader issues of power and status. The public sphere, I mean, we've referenced Benedict Anderson quite a lot this morning, but he may seem dated, but actually he has a number of concepts such as the public sphere. So, I mean, are you angry young men, are they creating a public sphere? Or are they tapping into an existing public sphere? These are sort of things that would have, certainly for me, coming from a similar area of study, but one quite different in other respects. Who cares? Well, that's always a very, Martin, I think a very apposite question. It can be very difficult for people starting off in research to construct an argument which appeals to a somewhat broader audience beyond the narrow core of experts. And I think you have demonstrated that you can tie in, I think, you can tie this material into broader debates. You have the potential to make those linkages. One area that I would have liked, again, to see some expansion is colonialism and the sort of colonial society these people were working within, British or French, and how maybe those foreign powers were using sectarianism potentially to create divisions and to reinforce their own position. So I would, I don't know if people here have access to, if the participants have access to each other's papers. I'm not certain. Okay, well they should, yeah. So that, it would be a useful learning experience, it seems to me, and I think most of your doctoral scholars, just maybe to get a sense of how things can be done and on different methodologies. I think you're an historian, am I right?
Yes.
Yes, because I noticed a lack of reference to theoretical material, which is fine. I'm an historian too, but it's always a giveaway, right? But, some theory is good, I think, also. I mean, I don't think we should shy away from it. But, just as much as you're comfortable with, and just as much as is useful for what you're doing, okay? Theory for the sake of theories, I think, is a rather redundant practice. So, being very practical about this, people need to get their PhDs and make careers. Let's be very honest here. If these pieces of work were circulated and usefully, it seems to me, some of the most useful conversations happen between doctoral students themselves, not old guys blathering on at the top table, okay? So it's these, and I know from my own experience as a student, I learned just as much from other students when I was doing my doctorate as I did from people higher up the academic scale. So I would very much recommend that, these informal conversations on the margins are just as useful as anything you'll probably hear from this end of the room. So I'm acutely conscious that this session was to go on till 1:45, but I think I've run out of things to say. Yes, I think so, because
Yeah.
I think I'd like to park my comments there and leave them with you for gestation and reflection.
I will.
Thank you.
I will eat them. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you very much. It's very interesting presentation. I didn't have the chance to read your paper, so I wanted just to make a few comments that might be useful for your research, your paper, and your PhD. Is revolving around the idea when we write the history, and this is connected to the idea who cares. Everybody cares now about Iraq. Everybody wanted, to know what's happening in Iraq, and if there are some historical roots to what's happening in Iraq. So I think, especially, the decision makers in the Western countries and some other countries. Usually, as historians, there is a big debate: is history for the present or not? And this is my concern, that we are studying the 20s and the 30s in Iraq in the eyes of 2018 or 17 or 11 or 12, and what's happening in Iraq. We are at the Arab Center preparing, in April, a conference about the 1920 revolution in Iraq. My colleagues who are in charge of this conference mentioned to me that the first writings or rewritings about the 1920 revolution of Iraq, describing it as a Shiite revolution, was produced in the 1960s. It wasn't produced in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and the 60s. So, throughout your, based on your presentation, I want to make a few important things that were happening in the 20s and the 30s in Iraq. The first one, the Iraqis, or the new state, or the new, it was building a state and building Iraqi identity, trying to marginalize the regional identities which existed over the last 400 years, and they were strong enough and competing with each other in a melting pot called the Iraqi identity. Even though that the Iraqis, are familiar with the term Iraq or the borders Iraq, but there was a process of building Iraqi identity coinciding with the building of the state, which means that there was a tension between the state and the bureaucracy. In one hand, the elite that is building the Iraqi state and the Iraqi identity in one hand, and the local and regional leaders or regional elite, regardless if they are Shias or Sunnis or Kurds or Christians. I think this is a very important dimension that you should take it into consideration in your study. Maybe it's not Shi'i, Sunni, maybe it's not Arab, Kurd tension, maybe it's a tension that is produced by virtue of the fact that we are building a new identity and a new state. Sometimes is manifested as a sectarian tension, and sometimes it's not. There is a tension in modernity. There is a new generation that is educated, that are from Shiite background, are competing on leading the local community in Iraq with the religious leaders. And this tension, from my point of view, in the 20s, 30s, 40s, is stronger than the tension between the Shiites and the Sunnis, or between the Shiites maybe and the state or the bureaucracy. And of course, there is this conflict with the colonial power that they wanted to free Iraq. I'm from Jordan, and sometimes I read, for example, the journals that were produced in the 20s, 30s, 40s in Jordan. The same language is used. the majority of the people who are farming the land, despite the fact that, Jordan is not really very big on agriculture. We don't have, rivers like, El Furat or Nile. And these few people who are controlling everything and harvesting everything. Now, we don't have Sunnis and Shias. The only explanation that we could explain these articles that published in the 2030s, either a class conflict, marginalized and non-marginalized, or people who are having more access to the state wealth than other people. The fourth thing of the conflict, maybe as well, we should take it into consideration, even the Arab nationalism. The pan-Arab nationalism was not a rooted phenomena in Iraq. So the people who were defending the Arab nationalism or the pan-Arab nationalism were usually facing the religious leaders, regardless if these religious leaders are Shiites or Sunnis. The fifth one may be the conflict between the urban and the rural, between the people who are sitting in Baghdad, who are living in Baghdad and were considered Ottomans despite the fact that they were Iraqi originalities, and the people who are in Najaf or in Tikrit or, I don't know, Anbar, the different regions. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I wouldn't certainly try to argue that the sectarian tension was particularly evident in this period, or was like endemic or primordial. But I suppose what's quite interesting is, the Shia interpretations of the revolution appear much later. But in this period, we see the sort of the initial rhetoric, this idea that Iraq is basically built on the skulls of the Shia. And they are using that word, the majority being the Shia, and they are definitely aligning Shiism with this sort of mass disenfranchised population in Iraq. So I guess that's kind of what I'd argue, is that you have these regional identities, and during this period, the regional identities are kind of transferring into sectarian identities. And you can see it even sometimes in some of the journals. For example, a journal that's published in Najaf in the early 1920s often uses the phrase an Arab from Al-Afrat, so it's like a Euphrates Arab, meaning obviously essentially a Shia, well meaning a rural person who's not from Baghdad. And then the same person who published this journal goes on to publish another journal that is much more sectarian later in the decade. So I suppose what I'm trying to capture is this transfer of the regional into the sectarian. And obviously it didn't then all blow up until much later. But there's definitely something, I don't know, some sort of shift, I think. And it's definitely related to class as well. I mean, you can clearly see that. There's literally this understanding that class and sectarian cleavages are entirely aligned in Iraq, I think. Yeah.
Now they are referring to these articles that the Jordanian identity has started in the 20s and the 30s, revolting at against the people who are coming from, Syria or Palestine or Iraq to occupy bureaucratic positions within the Jordanian government. Because we don't have this tension, because we don't have Shia Sunnis. Otherwise, it would have been, for example, the majority of the Sunnis, maybe it would be interpreted, the interpretation of these articles would be maybe is related to their sect or their religion, if there was a tension between, for example, the Muslims and the Christians. I mean, the process of manufacturing or emphasizing, some specific elements that is dominant now, maybe it wasn't dominant. And I feel that, for example, the tension within the local community between the Shiites and their fellow Shiites, or the people of Najaf and their fellow people of Najaf, maybe is stronger maybe than in Najaf and al-Basra. Yeah.
Yeah, precisely. I mean, I think that's true. It's definitely true in this period. And I suppose we have to be careful not to project back. And I wouldn't ever want to accentuate or exaggerate the level of tension. But at the same time, I think it's also perhaps naive to think that there wasn't any. If you look at the Ba'ath period, there is definitely some endemic discrimination against the Shia throughout this period, even if it's more a Tikriti kind of hegemony. Yeah. What's the time? Should we?
So, I have one.
Like the discourse of the Shia seems to have so much of what we call probably in Arabic madlumiyya, perceived injustice, and to what extent do you think that's related to British mandate policies of empowering the Sunnis, and particularly like appointing a Sunni king, King Faisal in Iraq? If we want to relate this to British policies in Iraq, and particularly the theme of colonialism that was mentioned earlier. Thank you.
Okay, I will use this microphone. So thank you for interesting presentation. I also wanted to ask about this British mandate, but as long as it was asked, I will ask about a bit earlier period about Ottoman Empire, because I'm not a specialist on Iraq, and I want to hear about a bit background information on this issue. As far as I remember, there were 3 provinces where one, Basra province, was like a Shia majority. I think Baghdad province was like a mixed with Sunnis and Shias, and you've mentioned about the relations between Shianess and Arabness. But what was referred to Shianess during the Ottoman Empire? How was the relation between Shianess and like Ottomanness, and how the Shias were represented in state bureaucracy at the time, and how was the policy of the Ottomans towards the Shias in Iraq, particularly?
It's on now? Okay, great. My question builds on those two, really, and it concerns governance and sort of the institutional structures of the state. I wonder, having looked at this period a little bit, I mean, not extensively like you have, but it strikes me that there's some really interesting questions to be raised about the impact of colonial mandatory governance processes on Shia groups. And so I wonder, to what extent is that covered in the literature that you've been looking at in these primary texts? I mean, obviously, I would imagine it feeds into the comment that Hayen is making about the sort of the perceived injustices. But I wonder how explicit is this frustration at colonial powers, at the urban elites that have been imposed by the British, in terms of the actual source material? Thank you.
So I suppose, looking at the Ottoman period first, it was obviously 3 provinces, and until the Tanzimat, the Shia areas of Iraq were more or less autonomous. Well, I say autonomous, they were controlled from Baghdad, but there was very little Ottoman state in that area. And then after, I think, 1850s, most of the south was again sort of formally incorporated into the empire and reoccupied. But yeah, there was, given the distance from the center, there was always this there was never really the same, like you would never get like a Shia from Najaf going to join the Ottoman army or serve in the bureaucracy like you'd get Iraqis from Baghdad, and that obviously then meant that when the British went on to form the state, all of these supposedly kind of westernized elites from Iraq happened to be Sunni, and they're all obviously Faisal's friends. And it's quite interesting in the late 19th century when the Ottoman state began to realize the extent to which the south was becoming Shia because of mass conversions of the tribes. The state became very, very paranoid about this and started to see the Shia in their official kind of communique as this fifth column for the Iranians. And they didn't really do anything, and they didn't act on it, so I don't think it had any kind of tangible impact on the development of sectarian relations, but it was certainly a significant, it was certainly a real fear that they had of this sort of Shia threat in the south, which is quite interesting. And then obviously, with the mandate, I think there's obviously this sense of injustice that's running through all of the discourse. And there's always this alliing of the elite with the colonialists, like they're always seen as a foreign colonial-backed elite. But I suppose after 1920, Iraq, although it still had advisors, British advisors, it was, in a sense, an independent country, with an Arab bureaucracy. So a lot of the way they're writing is very much against individuals in the Arab Iraqi government, but it is it is an anti-colonial. The discourse is very anti-colonial. But I'm also obviously lots of arguments are made about how the British basically patronised the Sunnis as a sort of like a strategy of divide and rule to ensure their continued influence in Iraq, and they were scared of this, of the Shia dominance. I'm not entirely sure that's accurate. I think, in a sense, you have to accept that there was probably so much prejudice and corruption among the Sharifian elite that it more or less, the sectarian system more or less reproduced itself. And I think the British, although they were quite hands-off, were actually sometimes wanted to improve the Shia's lot in the state. They didn't do anything to that effect, but they were aware that it needed to be enhanced. Yeah.
Hi, thanks for the great presentation. I do have a question about your methods, and I skimmed through the paper. I did not read it, so sorry if my question is not very accurate. It seems to me that you looked at Arabic sources, and these are like historical pieces, right? So I was just wondering if they were originally written in Arabic and how you dealt with the translation, or can you explain a little bit more of that?
They are written in Arabic, and I just struggled very hard to read. No, I can read Arabic, but and then obviously sometimes I have to get a bit of help. But most of the sources are all in Arabic. Yeah. And sometimes it's a little when they're making very kind of particular references in a historical context, it is a bit of a struggle to work out what they're talking about. But I suppose that's the fun of it. Yeah. Yeah.
Final question?
One final question, if I may. Thank you. Very interesting paper. I was just wondering if there was, I think it was Mark that asked a bit more about the ecology of the environment of your writers. I think would be interesting to know a little bit more. How did these writers position themselves within or against emerging discourses of Arabism or communism or other political trends that were, I guess, in the 1920s, all this was extremely new, even in Iraq. So it'd be interesting to hear a bit more about how these writers positioned themselves with other political traditions.
Yeah, I think actually with the Arabism especially, obviously, Al-Irfan had a kind of Arab nationalist credentials, but I think you see this a lot among a lot of the Shias in Iraq at this time. Often the Iraqi kind of dynamic is held that the Shia population have favoured an Iraqi identity or an Iraqist identity, and then the Sunnis have been more pan-Arabist. But I don't necessarily think, especially in the 1920s, like you say, when these are emerging quite fresh, I don't think that necessarily bears out. And often, yeah, they are. I think ultimately they are Arab nationalists, even if they're not really sort of thinking through the eventual implications of that ideology. And so, yeah, some of the very prominent Shia, even some of the Shia ulema were sort of playing around with ideas about Arab nationalism in this period. So I suppose going back to the kind of the environment they were living in and the circulation of Al-Irfan, and whether we can say it was significant as well, because it had this sort of Arab nationalist strand to it. I think it was probably quite well read and quite widely received. We don't actually know how many people were reading it because the offices were destroyed, I think, during the Lebanese Civil War. In terms of communism and sort of leftist political tendencies, I think they were quite anti that at this period, the writers in these particular journals. But then, obviously, you see in the 1930s, the Iraqi Communist Party develops very, very quickly and has a huge Shia presence. So there's actually a kind of essentially a competition, I would say, between Iraqist, perhaps Shia nationalism, but more just Arab nationalism developing, and then the leftist tendencies, and maybe in a way that supersedes the sectarian element really by the 40s and 50s. Yeah.
Should we say thanks to Chris?